so let's just start with the big question. What is neoliberalism? People bring it up a lot in a lot of online conversation, a lot of political discourse these days. Let's just try to get a general definition of it on the table.
Yeah, it's a little hard to define, but I would say it comes up in debates about what is the proper dividing line between markets and the government when it comes to economic decision-making. And the neoliberals in the U.S. context basically emerged in the 1970s and 80s, and they were trying to forge a middle ground, basically between two poles. One pole is just the very conservative right wing, markets always and everywhere, shouldn't even try to alleviate inequality after markets, you shouldn't regulate, that's one pole. And the other pole was basically the New Deal, Great Society style liberalism. And the neoliberals of the 1970s and 80s really thought the New Deal, Great Society had gone too far, regulated too much, taxed too much, and really wanted to have a pole in the debate in between those other two.
And this is kind of around the Washington Monthly crowd as they were kind of hashing out a bunch of these questions. So in the modern context, are there people used to actually call themselves neoliberals in the 70s and 80s. Do you hear people use that term today in the modern context to define themselves?
Yeah, I would say, so it's had a sort of funny resurgence. For a time, it had, I'd say, largely fallen out of favor among people who are not just sort of rock-hard conservatives. But in the past couple years, you've seen people sort of pick it up, and that classic thing where you take a form of abuse and you embrace it, and you have people calling themselves neoliberals. I would say that, maybe it only happens on Twitter, and I spend too much time on Twitter, but I feel like it's happening there. I do feel like there is a sense where they've lost all meaning of the term, because you'll have people be like, I'm a neoliberal, but I like unions and I really like the welfare state. And the original neoliberals sprung up to say unions should be rolled back and the welfare state should be shrunk. So I feel like a lot of the resurgence of it really does a lot of damage to understanding what exactly it means.
So that's interesting, because when I think of neoliberal, I think of a lot of people who are on the progressive left who use it as sort of an epithet. People kind of calling someone a neoliberal in a debate as a way of defining their views.
I think that's totally right. I think that's how it's been used mostly over like the past decade. It's basically people who call themselves, Democrats, who other Democrats or other people on the left say, no, you're actually kind of a coward and you're not willing to go far enough in what we need to do to get to a fairer society. And then in the past couple years, I feel like you've had the full circle where people, taking the epithet and trying to take it as a badge of honor.
So then what's the alternative? So if you're a Democrat or you're on the left, you're a neoliberal or you're what? What's the alternative?
I think the alternative to the left of neoliberal these days, I would probably say something like social democrat.
Okay.
Basically, people who look at sort of Western Europe and see higher levels of unionization and much larger spending on social insurance and safety net programs and say, that really looks good to me. So people who would favor more regulation than we have today, more efforts to fight back against inequality, a larger welfare state. So maybe social democrat is the other pole.
And is that where you put yourself?
Yeah, I'm pretty comfortable there.
Okay, yeah. Good. All right, so as a social democrat who's looking at the economy, how do you diagnose where we are right now as a country?
I think where we are right now is, we're just now finally about recovered from the damage done by the Great Recession.
That was 10 years ago.
Exactly. And so just this incredibly acute shock. And so on the one hand, that's good. I'm glad that we're no longer in the damage done by the Great Recession. On the other hand, the 30 years even before the Great Recession saw the economy develop huge problems, most notably the huge rise of inequality. Basically just this radically disproportionate share of all national income going to the very top, whereas living standards at sort of the bottom and the middle really barely just scraping by, almost stagnating, not quite growing a tiny bit, but nothing that a capitalist country should be proud of at all. And so to my mind, we've undone not even undone. We've recovered a bit from the Great Recession. We still have so much work to be done in order to make sure that march of inequality doesn't just start up again.
So you talk about inequality, and when you use the term "we have recovered," it's important, I think, I didn't learn very much in economics and statistics, except I do remember disaggregate the data, right? And so if you pull apart and you say "we," there's some evidence that the people in the top 1-2% recovered from the economic calamity 5 or 6 years ago, and it's just the rest of the country that's catching up.
No, that's right. When I say we have recovered, I'm making the mistake of looking at averages. So if you look at the unemployment rate, the overall average, it's actually a bit lower than it was before the Great Recession. But you're right, in terms of all of those years of income and wage losses and joblessness, and then figuring out where like median family income is today, I think that's only about where it was in 2007 and even a tiny bit below where it was in 2000. So yes, that's totally right. I think the whole point of inequality is there is no we. you have to be really specific about who you're talking about.
And so you're saying over the course of the last 30 years, there have been some policy choices that have been made that tend to have skewed things into the favor of the wealthiest people in our society. What kind of policy choices would you put in that bucket?
Yeah, I think a lot of the policy choices are associated with things that neoliberals back in the 70s and 80s called for. I think one that's underrated but super important is a lot of sort of deregulation of the labor market. So basically a very conscious attempt to restrain the growth of unions or even shrink them. A really conscious decision to not continually to increase the federal minimum wage, but let inflation batter it for kind of decades at a time. I think basically that just took a ton of leverage and bargaining power away from low and moderate wage workers. And if you look at where the inequality came from, like why did it happen? It came from the labor market. It came from the fact that for decades, average or typical workers' pay and economy-wide productivity used to grow together. Starting in the late 70s, they stopped growing together. Pay flattened, productivity continued to grow. So that means we generate lots of income as a country, and it just doesn't show up in the paychecks of ordinary workers. And a big reason why is this sort of very concentrated attempt to do labor market deregulation.
So we don't have a wealth creation problem, we have a wealth distribution problem.
That's right. I think it started as a wealth distribution problem, and it is so warped and damaged our economy, it is now actually throttling average growth as well. But for the past 30 years, the primary victims were low and moderate wage workers. I think even sort of workers across the board over the next 20 years will suffer if we don't do something about the distributional problem.
So you look at this as something caused by political choices, or is this something caused by macroeconomic forces?
I think it is mostly political choices. When I look back and I sort of see the suite of policy changes we made starting in the late 1970s and going through the 80s, from deregulation of the labor market, deregulation of finance, the Federal Reserve choosing in the late 1970s to sort of ignore unemployment and just make sure inflation was always low, even if that meant unemployment was excessively high. I think all of these things together were conscious political decisions, and yet they led to the inequality we've seen today.
So you discount the increase in technology, software that shows up, robots in manufacturing, the problems with not having as many young workers as we used to, and so we've got an age problem. Maybe the changing racial dynamics of the country as we become more diverse. You don't see any of those things as impacting this policy?
I would say on the technology front, mostly no. I mean, I think technology has been pretty neutral. It's actually, if you look about whose productivity is increased by technology, I mean, yeah, maybe some really highly trained accountant, but also cashiers are much more productive because of technology. So it's not obvious to me that that should have hurt them disproportionately. I think that story is really oversold, that technology is the scary thing. I think policy is more.
Well, what happens when we show up at a grocery store and there used to be 15 aisles of cashiers and now there's 15 machines that you self-check yourself out and 2 cashiers with a line that's like around the corner. You don't even want to get in the line with the cashiers anymore.
So specific jobs could definitely be displaced by technology. And then the question becomes, where do they go? Is there room for them somewhere else in the economy? And I think the problem is not have those people who've been displaced by technology found jobs. They largely have. It's just we've allowed the jobs to be crummy, again, by letting the minimum wage get battered, by letting unions get battered, by not securing a full employment kind of high pressure labor market. So in my mind, I'm much less scared of technology than I am of sort of the decision makers in the economy doing the wrong things.
All right, so how do we get out of this? What's the fix to get the country back on the right track, get higher incomes, we've got actually fairly low unemployment. We've got an income problem, right? Yeah,
I think we mostly have an income problem. I think the fix is to sort of turn the ship around and start trending more towards social democracy and away from neoliberalism. I think, a deeper welfare state with, things like healthcare provided much more by the state rather than by private markets. I think more progressive taxation. I would say one thing related to what you brought up before as well in terms of the racial dynamics of the country. I mean, I think one of the reasons why we trended from a drift toward social democracy toward neoliberalism is the New Deal had some great aspects, but it was really social democracy for white people. And then when demands in the 1960s and 70s, we need to cut in the whole population on this, I think dismayingly people chose, well, no, if I can't have social democracy for white people, it's social democracy for nobody. And so I think we need to defeat that. I think we need actual solidarity based on class that really says we're going to try to make everyone's lives better off.
So in the popular lexicon, I think a lot of people look at someone like Bill Clinton and they call him a neoliberal in terms of his economic policies. Some people would even put Barack Obama into that bucket. But how do you explain the fact that if you look at some of these big macroeconomic trends, when you had a Democratic presidency of an Obama, Clinton, you saw unemployment go down, jobs go up, you saw household incomes go up, you saw these big trends of poverty rates went down under these presidents, while under Republicans, all those indicators went in the wrong direction. So doesn't it, even the neoliberals seem like they may have had positive impacts on workers?
I think that's fair. I mean, I would say a couple things. One, people are complicated. No one is a pure neoliberal. I have my neoliberal tendencies in very specific policy places. Two, neoliberals are much better than the just let markets rip always and everywhere crowd, for sure. And then I would say, especially under both presidents, but I think especially under Clinton, I think that the importance of just the business cycle in determining people's outcomes is incredibly important. And Clinton was lucky enough to have a late 90s boom that delivered sort of broad-based wage growth. And it wasn't anything he really did. It was mostly the Fed decided, to its credit, for about 5 years to keep its foot off the brake. Whereas for most of that period, they'd actually been too vigilant and too willing to hit the brake. For this time, they sort of kept it off. So I'd say history's complicated. People are complicated. I do think neoliberal works as sort of a broad category, but you also have to keep into account like the nuance and the specifics as well.
Neoliberalism. I want to start with you, Gigi. What's your impression of what the term means?
So my impression is that neoliberalism means the market above everything else, and that government should just get out of the way, and that the market somehow will magically produce great benefits for consumers, for businesses, for our country. And I have an issue with that. Again, if that is indeed the definition, but that's my understanding of it. I'm more of a believer in what one would call managed capitalism. Mm-hmm. So you can't have a free market, you can't have a perfectly working market unless there's oversight. And that oversight needs to be government oversight. And I'm one of those folks, having worked in the government after 25 years as a consumer advocate, who actually believes that government can do good and make sure that markets work, and also that certain things that markets can never really take care of, privacy, personal liberty, the right to vote, get taken care of as well.
So Jim, here's my question. Are there Democrats who believe that the market is supreme above all?
I don't think so.
Is it that pure?
Just on neoliberalism,
yeah.
I've been called a neoliberalist.
You're in good company, my friend.
But I've never used that term to describe myself or my own views. And I think there's kind of two definitions out there.
Yeah.
So there's one which is the definition that Gigi posed, which is, it's market primacy above all else, and that's the origins of neoliberalism. And it's Alan Greenspan and others, other names, other big names. They are more laissez-faire economics and a response to Keynesian economics. And then there was a group of Democrats that came along in the 80s, and it was Paul Tsongas and Gary Hart. And I worked on Gary Hart's campaign, and Gary Hart is my first political love. And,
we never quite recovered from that.
Too bad he had other crushes.
Right.
True. But in '84, before we knew about this crushes, he almost won. And it was a view that I think is close to the way you defined it, which is, kind of managed markets, like a managed capitalism. Is that the market signals are very, very important, but don't ignore the market externalities that are very, very harmful. And so that's kind of been my view about this. But like I said, it's never a term I've been completely comfortable with, as a philosophy or as an epithet.
So the question seems to me, is it binary? And sometimes when you hear the conversation that takes place in politics today, it feels as if it's like you're either a neoliberal and you don't believe in anything that has to do with government involvement in the marketplace, or you're a social democrat, which is how Josh Bivens described it. You're a social democrat and you're kind of leaning toward a really strong social welfare state. and not market-based economy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think that's a false choice. You don't necessarily have to believe in government control of everything on the one hand, or corporate or market control of everything. There is something in the middle, and I actually think it's been very interesting to see folks who I think would consider themselves social democrats criticize the Obama administration, because I'm really proud.
It's amazing that Barack Obama is considered a pretty conservative person.
I
in
think the reason that Barack Obama couldn't do everything he wanted to do was because he had a Congress that wouldn't let him do a darn thing. And I think people lose sight of that. I can say from my experience at the FCC, I had a boss who just happened to work for two industries, the wireless industry and the cable industry.
Tom Wheeler at the FCC.
Yep.
And for the record, you guys were there. You were the ones who helped implement net neutrality.
Right, and the strongest form of net neutrality, and such a strong form of net neutrality that the cable and broadband industry just went absolutely crazy. So he believed that it was really consumers who ought to come first, and everything came down from that. All decisions came from that. It wasn't from, it was certainly not from, whose ox is going to be gored in business. So we really came from it, I think, from a perspective that government can do good for the people. It doesn't mean he ignored what industry needed or lost sight of it, but they weren't the principal reason for what we did.
Part of this debate that comes up is, did we end up in the last 30 years of wages being stagnant and incomes and wealth, having this wide disparity? Did we end up there because of policy choices or macroeconomic forces that took us there?
Yeah.
Where do you fall in that debate?
Well, I think macroeconomic forces are really a major part of that, and then there are policy choices that you do to react to it. And if you look at the history of capitalism or modern capitalism of the last century or so, there are periods where capitalism goes off the rails. And, what is it that you have to do to put it on the rails? Because I do think that capitalism in a regulated, managed way is the way to lift the most people out of poverty and to create, a shared prosperity and create strong middle class. And the macroeconomic forces today are really globalization and technology.
Well, let me put you on a question about healthcare. This is an example that is in the news all the time, right? So it seems to me that we had a healthcare marketplace, big free market healthcare system, but that market system seems to have failed. There were some market failures that were taking place. We weren't distributing the product well to people. Prices were out of whack. So how much government intervention is required to get the healthcare system in a way back to a point where real people and consumers can benefit from it?
Yeah, so I'm not saying we should have a free market healthcare system. We've never really had a free market healthcare system. We've had all sorts of, probably 50%. Don't footnote me on this. Yes. Of healthcare is paid for by either federal or state government, and probably another third is paid for by business, and then probably the remaining 1/6 is paid for by individuals. So it's always been like higher education, something that has been quasi-public and quasi-private, and the healthcare system is a mess and it needs reform. I think Obamacare was a very important next step in healthcare because it expanded coverage to a lot of people, but also started doing the things to contain costs. And, the fee-for-service healthcare system, which is what traditional Medicare is a disaster. Moving more towards, value-based healthcare payments and, other ways to put quality over the quantity of healthcare system, and then other ways to reduce costs in the healthcare system, both on prescription drugs and what we are paying to providers and to doctors. Those are the way to contain costs. But yeah, it is a quasi-system that is not working great.
So Gigi, the other side of that, people want to go to Medicare for all. They want to just take over the healthcare system and have the government run the whole thing.
Yeah, some people do. I am not a healthcare expert. I will say, as a personal matter, I still think that there is a role. If people do want to keep their private health care, they should be able to. But if they don't want to, there has to be a safety net. And I think that's been part of some of the policies around neoliberal thought has been the social safety net has kind of gotten ripped away. And that's why I say it's really important to have some entity other than the market making sure that there are certain rights, that there are certain abilities that people don't have. Like, for example, I'll give an example, going back to my area of expertise, access to internet, right? And the private market is not going to provide for universal internet access. And universal internet access doesn't just help the underprivileged, it helps all of us, because when we're all connected, the network is more valuable. Well, that's something that government has to provide. It does provide it now. I will say, unfortunately, this administration is chipping away at that. They're destroying a program called Lifeline,
Sure,
which provides a small subsidy for broadband access. So, there are just times where the government has to step in and say, look, this is a value that's important to us. Democracy, right? Privacy, access to communications. And we've got to step in.
So the policies that have been brought up, though, are the decline in unionization, the increase in globalization and the integrated economies between the United States and people abroad, taxation policy that favors the wealthiest. So there have been some real policy choices that were, one would argue, are market-based, free market-based choices that may have gotten us in the fix where 1 or 2% of the population has such a large percentage of the wealth.
Yeah, so we should raise taxes on wealthy people. I don't think there's that much disagreement on the Democratic side on that.
So then why do people argue so much about this, right? So why is it that when we're having debates, people will throw out, well, that's just a neoliberal position, and you're just saying that because it's something that neoliberals think, instead of engaging on the kind of policy question that's on the table?
Here's what I think. When I look at what is the economic misery that's out there today, and there's definitely a concentration of wealth, but there's a concentration of opportunity as well too. And if I was going to write a book on the economy, I'd call it the concentration of everything. And between the years 2000 and 2016, the borough of Queens created more private sector jobs than Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin combined. Okay? So I think in the past, when the economy was growing at a decent clip, and I know we had one huge recession and another smaller recession, but much of the country benefited and most people benefited. And I think because of technology and globalization and the premium that we have on where you live, like these superstar cities, and the type of qualifications you have, that success in the economy is going to fewer people and fewer places. And I do think that those are macroeconomic trends. And where...
Would you say that we need more government intervention right now then?
Yes, absolutely.
So let me go to globalization, because I think it's a little simplistic to just say globalization pushed us to wage inequality, income inequality, and the decline of the middle class, and a whole litany of bad things. It's that we exported our policies overseas, so our deregulatory policies, our trade policies, and we forced it pretty much on most countries other than like some in East Asia, like South Korea, Japan. They kind of rejected it. So it's not simply that, because I think the fact that we can all connect with everybody around the world and do trade around the world, I think that's a positive thing. But I think that's not what caused the problems that we have here today, is that we exported some of the bad policies that we had here that created income inequality and what have you overseas.
When you take a look back at different administrations, Republicans versus Democrats, right? So part of the debate that you hear happening in policy political circles right now is kind of like the light blue Democrats, the ones who are more free marketers, are basically the same as the people who are red. They're basically the same as the Republicans. They are guilty as much as the Republicans. But Bill Clinton, who I think most people, if you're thinking about neoliberalism, people will think of Bill Clinton as one. You talk about 22 million, 23 million jobs created. You talk about decreases in poverty, decreases in unemployment, increases in household people owning homes, household wealth. Same thing with Obama. When you go back and you look at Republican administrations, except for Reagan, pretty much every other Republican administration of the last half of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century had those numbers going in the wrong direction, and the Democratic administrations had those numbers going in the right direction, even the ones considered to be conservatives. So where's the debate that's happening in the Democratic Party right now? Why is there such heat around this idea of neoliberals versus social democrats and not some level of we're all on the same team and we can figure out how to make this work?
Because we're Democrats. That's why. I mean, if we didn't have anything to fight about, I don't know what we would talk about.
What would we be doing?
Now, it's interesting, neoliberalism, if you think it's a bad thing, as you said, it really has cut across administrations. I mean, the biggest airline deregulator was Alfred Kahn, who worked for Jimmy Carter. Bill Kennard, who was FCC chairman under Clinton, really started kind of the deregulation of internet access, or he refused to sort of intervene to make sure that that it was regulated more heavily so that everybody had affordable access. So there's plenty of blame to go around. It's just I think Democrats kind of eat their own, but I do think that there is a desire in the party, and I'd say among the American people, to look at markets in a different way, to look at government in a different way.
So my challenge to the people who probably sit closer to your way of thinking about policy is it feels like there are more conversations about process outcomes or process deliberation than there are about personal outcomes. What do I mean by that? When Bill Clinton ran for office, he wanted to create more jobs. He wanted to get healthcare costs lower. He had policy outcomes for real people. Yeah. He didn't argue we need to all get people of good faith around a table and we can all suss out what the right answer is, or why is it that we're fighting so much? It wasn't about the process of arriving to an answer. It was the answer that we were looking for, and then we could argue later about what tactic we employed. Do you see that coming from kind of the more center part of the Democratic Party, a little less outcome orientation, a little more process?
Well, if that's what's coming out, then that's a problem. And so let me tell you where I think the Democratic Party ought to go, or at least the wing of the Democratic Party that I represent needs to go. I think we need, in this modern era, or this digital era, a new contract on work for people. And that work should guarantee a series of things. A decent enough wage, a retirement that is very, very secure, healthcare that is stable, secure, and affordable, some ladder up to a promotion or a better career, and some time to spend with your family and to take care of your kids or when you get sick. And I think that there was a contract for the industrial age, and there is not a contract for the digital age. And the digital age is just going to be different. And this discussion that we're having, it's happening in all the Western democracies. They're all not doing real well. There is a lot of anxiety. People aren't really sure they're going to be able to earn a good life where they live, particularly if you're not in the high-flying urban areas of each of these countries. So I think that is the fundamental challenge, and that has to be a promise. And I think this can be done, but I think it's this sort of, for lack of a better term, kitchen table type issues that we have to say, this is the promise we want to make so that you've got work and it's going to work for you. We've got to make work work.
Gigi, do the scales tip back toward government intervention in this era, though? Do you think if you had to look at the pendulum swing, is the pendulum swinging back toward more government intervention, more regulation, or should we be looking for more market solutions?
No, I think we can't go any further towards market solutions. And you see that ordinary people are greatly concerned about the power of some of the tech platforms, the power of cable and telecom industries, the power of pharmaceutical companies and healthcare companies. I just don't know how much further to the market-based area we can go. So I think the pendulum has to swing back. The question is, how far will it swing back? And regulation is not a dirty word. I like to use the word oversight, right? There needs to be a cop on the beat to make sure that large industries are serving the public while making tons of money for their stockholders.
You're going to get in trouble for that one.
No. Like I said, I believe in managed capitalism, right? I do think sometimes people like Elizabeth Warren get a bad rap because people say, well, she's a socialist. I don't think she is at all. I think she believes in capitalism, but that there needs to be oversight. And And when we talk about regulation and oversight, those rules cannot be set by incumbents. And I think that's really important. And this is something I've seen in the history
So
of
the people
studying.
being overseen can't be the ones writing the rules.
Exactly. And there's so much history of this in the communications industry. When cable first, retransmitted broadcast signals, the broadcast industry ran to the FCC and got all kinds of restrictions on the kind of programming that cable could carry, right? Then the cable industry tried to restrict the satellite industry. So you can't, there are rules, even in this marketplace environment, but they're often rules that benefit incumbents. Okay. And so I think that's really important. Who writes the rules is as important as whether there are rules or not.
So then we didn't even get into where the money comes from that funds campaigns, which
Right,
is the
campaign
other part
finance. Yeah,
of this
that's key.
conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
But we're going to do that next time. Thank you, too, for joining us.
Oh,
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thanks for watching Hill TV on YouTube. Be sure to click subscribe and hit the bell so you know when we post new videos. And head to thehill.com for all the latest political news.